Esther. It's great to be with you this morning. You all have such a very special place in my heart. I love you and I miss you so very much. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of your morning this morning. The theme for your Women's Day comes from one of my very favorite books of the Bible, the book of Esther. And among other reasons, one of the things I love about the book is it has just about everything a good story should have. There's kings and queens, there's love and lust and betrayal, secrets and conspiracies, murder. And my very favorite, spoiler alert, the good guy wins in the end. It's a fantastic book, tiny book, but full of so many things. So we're just gonna jump right in this morning. We're gonna start with a little bit of background and a big picture view of the book of Esther. Now the book comes from a very crazy and unprecedented time in the history of God's people. God's chosen people, the Jews, were taken into captivity around 598 BC by the Babylonians. About 50 years later, the Persians overtake the Babylonians, and God moves the heart of the first Persian king, and he allows the Jews to return back to their homeland. Esther and some of the other Jews don't return back to the homeland, and they remain in exile in Persia. Somewhere along the line, Esther's parents die, and she's raised by her uncle Mordecai. And that's where she is when we meet her in the story. So I said there was royalty, and that's a little crazy too. So in the very beginning of the book of Esther, King Xerxes gets very upset with his wife, so upset actually that he removes her from being queen. I don't know if that's unprecedented, but it certainly is a little crazy. And then he begins an empire-wide search for a new queen, and that actually is unprecedented. Traditionally, a king would choose his wife from a small group of royal families that would allow him some strategic political alliances. However, that's not what King Xerxes chose to do. During this search, Esther is taken to the palace, and she's ultimately chosen to be queen. Then comes the conspiracy and drama. So hang on with me for just a minute. Haman, the king's right-hand man, really dislikes Esther's uncle Mordecai, and he knows that Mordecai is a Jew. So he underhandedly gets the king to sign an edict killing all of the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. Now we know that Esther's a Jew, but King Xerxes didn't know that Esther was a Jew. Uncle Mordecai appeals to Esther and asks her to go before the king and beg for the lives of the Jews. She does that, and she's ultimately able to save her people. That's a great story. But why go there today? Why today as we sit here in the midst of our pandemic and we're considering us being born for such a time as this, as 2020? Let's look at this verse from Romans 15, verse 4. It says, "Everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope." And hopefully the book of Esther can teach us endurance. It can show us God's encouragement and ultimately leave us with hope. So let's take a deeper look. Well, we may not be privileged to the beauty treatments and the royal clothing that Esther was, but I do believe we can relate to her in many ways, and there are many similarities between our circumstances. First of all, we both find ourselves living in crazy, unprecedented times in history. And we just talked about the craziness and the history of Esther, but what about us? As you know all too well, we are living in some pretty crazy times. This pandemic is something else. So many people have lost jobs and have really struggled to try to find new ones. People are struggling with their own health issues of loved ones, and some even have lost loved ones, all the while unable to say a proper goodbye. So many people are struggling with loneliness and depression. We're not really going to go there, but online schooling, that's crazy. My son is teaching himself calculus out of a textbook, and I'm trying to learn some Spanish to help my daughter with her Spanish. My heart goes out to all of you parents of elementary kids. It's so hard to teach our children in an online environment. How about the depth of the systemic problem of racial injustice in our country? And while the depth of the problem might not be new, the knowledge of the depth of it is for a lot of us. And the destruction, the devastation, and the pain that is creating in the forefront of our minds and our hearts and all that people throughout the country are experiencing. It's a really unprecedented time in our history. And recently, just gearing up for the election, the divisiveness that our country is going through is the worst I've ever seen. We're living in some crazy, unprecedented times. Esther, like many of us, was isolated, separated, and most likely very lonely. So her family was exiled to Persia, and they stayed there away from the rest of the Jews, even after many of them chose to go back to their homeland. Then she lost her parents, and when the king went in search of a bride, she was taken to the palace, away from the only family, friends, and community she had ever known. And while she was in the palace, she was completely separated from all the other people. The king's harem was completely secluded. She was unable to talk with her family or friends, and completely surrounded at the time by pagan Persian women and eunuchs. Life inside the palace was also most likely very different for her. What she ate, how she dressed, the day-to-day customs. Life had been turned upside down for Esther, and she was all alone in it. It's hard for us. Many of us feel the same way, separated, isolated, and lonely. It's hard to live in a basically quarantined manner. It's hard not to see each other regularly. I've seen my mom once since the pandemic started, and we just talked last week that we're canceling our Thanksgiving plans together. It's lonely and isolating. I feel lonely many days and miss my friends and family. And even when we do get out, life as we know it is so very different. The social distancing, the masks, the temperature checks. When I do get to see a cherished friend, I can't wrap my arms around them and hug them like I used to. I still do a double take when I go to the grocery store and see people wearing masks. It's just so surreal. We can feel isolated in all of this separation and change. And as if all of that weren't enough for Esther, Haman, the king's right-hand man, decides to kill the Jews. Not just kill, the scriptures say, destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children. Imagine what she must have been thinking. Why, God? How much more? God, what are you doing? And I think many of us feel the same way and are asking the same questions. Why, God? How much more? God, what are you doing? The pain, the heartache, the loneliness, the fear, the prejudice, the injustice, the hatred, the politics. Enough. And what was Esther's response to this? She wanted to pull the covers up over her head and do nothing. It was too much. It was too hard just to even think about it. She just wanted to hold on to a tiny bit of hope, do nothing, and survive. And I think maybe that's where many of us are today. We just want to survive. And maybe that means binge watching Netflix or comfort eating your way through a new cookbook. Just hold on to that little piece of hope that we have. Self-protect and do nothing. And it's at this point that Mordecai says, your theme scripture for this morning, perhaps you have been called for such a time as this. And we quote these words all the time, right? They're so encouraging. We put them in birthday cards and share them at graduations. You're amazing. You've been called for such a time as this. And that's true. But that's not how Mordecai meant these words when he initially said them. Esther had decided it would be too difficult for her to go to the king. She could die trying. And so she decided to do nothing and sent the message back to Mordecai that that was her choice. It's on the heels of this that Mordecai begins his encouragement, or rather admonishment, of Esther with these words. in Esther chapter 4, verse 12. It says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. It was a wake-up call for Esther. It was a life-defining moment. These words changed her life. She could wait, but why? What good would that do? What harm could that do? More importantly, what about the sovereignty of the Almighty God even in this situation? God's name might not be mentioned once during the book of Esther, but his handiwork is all over it from the very beginning. Vashti, Queen Vashti's removal, that's the hand of God. What about of all of the people in the entire kingdom? Again, unique that King Xerxes chose a kingdom-wide, an empire-wide search for a wife, but of all of the people, Esther, an orphaned Jew, an exile with no pedigree, chosen as the new queen. That can only be the hand of God. And there's so many more details as you study out the book. You will see God throughout the entire book. Day and night, he's moving. I want to look at just two of my favorite behind-the-scenes appearances of God in the book. The first is that the calendars in the book of Esther line up with secret messages from God. Let's read Esther chapter 3, verse 7. It says, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, they cast the pure, that is the lot, in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month. And the lot fell in the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there's a certain people dispersed and scattered among your peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people who do not obey the king's laws. It's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by courier to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was issued as law in every province and made known to the peoples of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Wow. You have to look close, but even in this passage, even in the passing along of information, we can see the hand of God. Secretaries were summoned to write out the edict and have it delivered to the people on the 13th of Nisan. And at first glance, that might not mean much to us, but let's flip back to Leviticus chapter 23, verse 4. It says, these are the Lord's appointed feasts, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. The news of their imminent destruction was delivered to the Jews as they're sitting down to begin the Passover. They're sitting down, teaching their children, reciting the stories of God's miraculous deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt on the night that they realize they need another miraculous deliverance. That's not coincidence. That's the hand of God. God was secretly letting them know, I'm here. I've got it. I'm in control. And I've always been. My other favorite behind the scenes appearance of God involves a wardrobe change. So as we said, the good guy wins in the end. But before that, as things are beginning to turn around, the bad guy's hanged, and Mordecai becomes King Xerxes' new right-hand guy. Now, because of the Persian law, Mordecai can't rescind the edict to kill the Jews, but he does deliver another edict which allows the Jews to protect themselves. And here in Esther chapter 8, Mordecai is coming out of the king's presence with the new edict. Verse 15, it says, Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. Again, that might not seem like much to us, but go back to Exodus chapter 28 and read there, and you'll see that King Xerxes dressed Mordecai in the same way that a Jewish royal priest would dress. And he presented Mordecai to the people in the same way that Aaron and his descendants would present themselves in their royal robes to the people after they had finished serving God in the temple. God is screaming, you may have forgotten me, but I have not forgotten you. 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 13 says, even if we are faithless, he will still be faithful because he cannot disown himself. Then Esther goes and appeals to the king. She had been chosen to set her own interests aside, to let go of her fears and to trust God. And she did. And as a result of her divine calling, she saved the Jews. So it's easy to look back at Esther 2,500 years later and see the hand of God. His sovereignty, his providence, even when he seemed absent. And sure, hindsight is 20/20, and perspective is often easier on the other end of things when we look back. We can be like Esther in our own situation, and we can not see, or we can choose to wake up and to try to see. We can choose to fight to get perspective. Even on this side of the struggle, we can choose to stand up and to trust God right where we are. And although we don't always appreciate it, God's timing is always perfect. Sisters, you've been placed in your situation and your sphere of influence for such a time as this. The hard truth of Mordecai's exhortation to Esther is just as true for us. We can refuse to walk in obedience to God. We can cower in fear and discouragement and do nothing. We can run from our calling, and God will certainly achieve what he wants to achieve. However, for us, we might pass up on the fulfillment of our life purpose. We weren't called to an easy life, but a purposeful life. Even when God seems absent, he is still very much in control. And through these times, God is changing us, transforming us into women we otherwise never would be. We learn grit. We learn contentment. We learn discipline and perseverance, or as some versions of the Bible say, long suffering. And all of these things help to make us more like Jesus. Sisters, what's your current scenario? What's God trying to teach you during this time? Like Esther, we might be tempted to just hold on and survive. But we're made for more than that. I encourage you to fight to see what God is trying to show you and what God is trying to do behind the scenes in this unprecedented time in your life. Often, God is never more present than when he seems strangely absent. And God is still in the miracle working business. And if you're visiting with us today, well, now might just be the perfect time to seek God or to make some changes in your relationship with God. Although life is indeed crazy right now, we've never had more time in our lives to slow down and to seek God. Thank you so much for allowing me to be with you this morning. I've so enjoyed our time together. I hope you feel encouraged, and I hope that you see God, that He is in the miracle working business, that He is still here, He is still active, and He loves us so very much, even when we can't see it or understand it. We all indeed have been born for such a time as this.